I want to start by thanking the organizers of the meeting for inviting me to join you. I regret I can't be there in person because I have been to Greece and it is one of my favorite places in the world. You have an absolutely beautiful country. I also want to thank Karl for the overly generous introduction. That was not necessarily warranted, but it was certainly appreciated. So he mentioned that my co-authors and I, and you see their names here, have created a paper that was published just this past month in the American Journal of Public Health. And I'm going to be discussing the findings from that paper. You'll see that 4 of the authors have disclosures. I don't believe that any of them represent true conflicts of interest. You'll have an opportunity, if you see the entire slides at a later stage, to review them if you wish to do so. I want to start out by emphasizing that this talk is focused on the situation in the US. We know that circumstances are varying from one country to another, and that those circumstances include basic policies. Are e-cigarettes permitted within the country? They're not in several countries. Are they prohibited? They are in several countries. Where they're permitted, are they permitted with enthusiasm, as you would see in the United Kingdom, or with substantially less enthusiasm, as you would see in the United States? The products themselves differ somewhat from country to country. So the UK has a limit on nicotine content, whereas the US does not, just as an example. The scientific findings that I'll be presenting here, I believe, are quite generalizable, but please appreciate that I am talking about the US situation. So the origins of the paper, I think everyone attending this meeting is aware that there's a range of views on e-cigarettes. You see the spectrum here. On the left-hand side, there are people who focus on the risk to kids, and on the right-hand side, there are people who focus on the potential benefits for adult smokers. The risks to kids include what you see here: vaping causing nicotine addiction among young people, vaping by never smoking youth causing some of them to try smoking, and nicotine harming the brains of the developing brains of young people. On the other end of the spectrum, the supporters of vaping point to the fact, as they believe it is a fact, and I'll review the evidence, that vaping assists smokers in quitting smoking, that vaping poses far less risk to users' health than does smoking, and that smoking among youth is declining rapidly while vaping is rising in the US, and I'll return to that point. Now, in the US, the mainstream of public health, and I'm thinking here of government agencies, non-governmental organizations in medicine and public health, and so on, they focus heavily on the risk to kids, almost exclusively on those risks. Their pronouncements and their influence on policymakers and the media have had a profound influence on the American public's understanding of vaping. There was a recent study of US news articles from 2015 to 2018 that found that 70%, 70, of the articles covered the risk to kids. Only 37% of them mentioned the potential benefits for adult smokers. In a 2019 national survey in the United States, nearly half of the respondents incorrectly agreed that vaping is as dangerous as or more dangerous than cigarette smoking. Only 1 out of 8 of the respondents said that it was less dangerous. The others said they did not know. The public's inaccurate perception has worsened over time. While scientists clearly differ in their views of the relative risks and benefits of e-cigarettes, many of them, including those of this who authored this paper, my colleagues and I, who are former presidents of the Society for Research on Nicotine and Tobacco, believe that it is essential that we give more credibility, more emphasis on adults and the influence on vaping on them, and thereby create a sense of balance where we're focusing on both the potential risks and the potential benefits. So why this particular group of authors? Well, I thought that it would be interesting to contact my fellow past presidents of SR&T. At the time, there were 26, to see how many of them would be interested in co-authoring a paper on this subject that referred to the need for greater balance between the risks to kids and the benefits for adults. 15 of them, much to my surprise and delight, 15 of them agreed to serve as co-authors of the paper. 3 did not join us because they had what they believed would be considered conflicts of interest. We couldn't locate one of the past presidents. 7 declined to join us. So that means that if you look at the entire group of past presidents of the most important intellectual society addressing issues of research and on nicotine and tobacco, 2/3 of those who were essentially eligible to join the paper did so. And I think that's a fairly important statement about at least one view of the issues here by scientists. You see in front of you the issues I'm going to cover. I'm going to give a broad overview, but I will provide some detail regarding several of these. There's one conspicuous absence here. I'm not going to talk about the health effects of vaping relative to those of smoking. You can have detailed papers on that. There are detailed papers on that. I am going to rely simply on the overall opinion of major national authorities like Public Health England and like the United States National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, both of which have concluded that vaping is substantially less dangerous than cigarette smoking. So that's where I'm going to work from for the remainder of the paper. I want to start with the evidence that vaping increases smoking cessation. One of the reasons that my colleagues and I believe that this is so important, and that in fact the evidence is pretty persuasive, is that we've identified 5 entirely different kinds of evidence that vaping is increasing smoking cessation. I'm going to go through each of these individually. The first are randomized controlled trials, which I was asked about at the end of the previous session. There are quite a few of these, although not many of them are considered very high quality. 2 of the very best you see in the first 2 bullets here. Peter Hayek and his colleagues looked at English smoking cessation clinics with a 1-year trial comparing e-cigarettes to nicotine replacement therapy products. So it's sort of standard that you would use in most smoking cessation clinics. And they found that the e-cigarettes at the end of 1 year had almost twice the rate of biochemically confirmed cessation as did the users of NRT, 18% versus 9.9%. The following year, Walker and her colleagues published a study that found that at 6 months, nicotine patch combined with nicotine e-cigarettes outperformed patch with nicotine-free e-cigarettes and also patch alone. So this demonstrated that nicotine e-cigarettes may increase the effectiveness of existing cessation aids. Hartman-Boyce and her colleagues published a Cochrane Review article in 2020. If you're not familiar with the Cochrane Review, it is considered a state of the art. And when I say the Cochrane Review, I mean the Cochrane Reviews on a variety of scientific subjects are considered state of the art. Reviewing 26 RCTs, Hartman-Boyce and her colleagues concluded that there was moderate certainty evidence, that was the exact phrase, that e-cigarettes are superior to governmentally authorized nicotine replacement therapy products in smoking cessation. And I should tell you, as a reader of Cochrane Reviews, moderate certainty is actually strong praise coming from them. There are also a wide variety of population studies, different kinds of studies, and they have different kinds of findings. 4 of them in England and the US found that vaping led to an increase in smoking cessation population-wide of about 10 to 15%. In the US, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention recently reported that in 2018, 15.1% of smokers who quit for greater than 6 months, who managed to quit for greater than 6 months were using e-cigarettes. 3.3% were using other non-cigarette tobacco products, and 6.6% were using no tobacco products. In a separate report, CDC has noted that smokers choose e-cigarettes as their preferred method of smoking cessation. They use e-cigarettes more than any other product or service, if you will. We know from a wide number of studies that regular and frequent use of e-cigarettes leads to increases in smoking cessation, while infrequent use does not. This probably reflects the fact that people who are using e-cigarettes frequently like them, and they may be more motivated to quit. But it could also reflect the fact that people who use e-cigarettes infrequently are using them as a temporary substitute for cigarettes in locations in which they're not permitted to smoke. These people may actually want to quit less than does the general population. Intriguingly, we can look at sales data on cigarettes and e-cigarettes, and I'm also going to refer in a moment to heated tobacco products. Heated tobacco products are not big in the United States at this point. E-cigarettes are much more popular. In Japan, which I'll reference, e-cigarettes are almost not used at all. I'm not even sure if they're legal, but heated tobacco products are widespread. In the US, there's an inverse relationship between cigarette and e-cigarette sales. Historically, if we look at the US data, we see a 2 to 3% annual decline in cigarettes sold. As e-cigarette sales have risen substantially in recent years, however, cigarette sales have dropped by as much as 6% per year. We also have a number of studies, primarily from economists, that are demonstrating that there is a positive cross-price elasticity of demand between cigarettes and e-cigarettes. This indicates that they are substitutes. Now, if you're not familiar with the expression cross-price elasticity of demand, what this is saying is that if the price of cigarettes goes up significantly, the demand for e-cigarettes will increase. Conversely, if the price of e-cigarettes goes up substantially, the demand for conventional combustible cigarettes will rise. They are substitutes. In Japan, adoption of heated tobacco products from 2015 to 19 has been accompanied by a decrease in cigarette sales of 1/3. I am not aware of any other country at any point in history that has experienced that rapid a decrease in the demand for cigarettes. We also have research, primarily by economists, that demonstrates the unintended consequences of policies restricting vaping. A notable one recently was looked at an e-cigarette tax in the state of Minnesota in the US. And they found that it had increased adult smoking and reduced adult smoking cessation. They concluded that taxing e-cigarettes at the same rate as cigarettes nationwide could deter some 2.75 million smokers from quitting smoking over the next 10 years. And by the way, the federal government here, you're probably aware of all the machinations over trying to come up with a reconciliation bill in Congress. They are looking at doubling the federal excise tax on cigarettes, which is actually very low. It's just over $1. But increasing and imposing a federal excise tax on e-cigarettes that would essentially be the equivalent of the cigarette tax. I'll talk about why that is highly undesirable at a later stage, in addition to what you can see right here. We also know from 2 different studies that state restrictions on minors' access to e-cigarettes have been associated with higher rates of adolescent cigarette smoking. There are a number of other studies from economists that demonstrate similar unintended consequences. I think everybody in this audience is very aware of the natural experiment in harm reduction that's taken place in Sweden in the case of snus. Karl has played a very important role in this in Norway. Swedish men have been using snus for decades. Swedish males have the lowest male cigarette smoking rate in Europe, and it may be in the world. But males' tobacco use rates are not especially low. They're quite similar to male tobacco use rates in other European countries. The difference is that in the other countries, most of the tobacco use is cigarettes, whereas in Sweden, it has been the far less harmful snus. This is translated into the fact that Swedish males have the lowest tobacco-related death rates among males in the EU. And more recently, thanks in no small part to people like Karl, men and women in Norway have been adopting snus and giving up smoking. So if you put all of these together, excuse me, this slide is coming up, but I just want to say if we put all of these 5 classes of evidence together, it presents a strong case. It's not definitive, but a strong case that vaping does increase smoking cessation. And for reasons that we'll be considering, it could do so much more in countries like the US. So I want to turn to the principal concerns about youth vaping. You see them here. There are 3 of them, and I'm going to go through each of them individually. First is the notion that vaping causes nicotine addiction. I think it's very highly likely that there are some youth who are being addicted to nicotine as a result of vaping. But contrary to the fears in the United States and to the expressions of leaders in the United States public health community, those numbers are probably relatively few. First of all, we need to limit our concerns to tobacco naive youth. It's not relevant to ask whether kids who are vaping, who are also smoking cigarettes, or were just smoking cigarettes, are addicted to nicotine. They've been exposed to nicotine, and it's much more likely they would be addicted. The only relevant group here are those who have vaped but not used any other tobacco products. When we look at that group, we're looking at a low prevalence of vaping, 9.1% in 2020, according to the most recent study in the last year. That's in the past 30 days. And they have a low frequency of vaping. Only 2.3% are vaping 20 days or more. Small percentages of them are exhibiting signs of nicotine dependence, according to the study by Jarvis and his colleagues. Frequent vaping is far more common among current or former smokers than among youth who have never smoked. Many current and former smokers were already addicted to nicotine prior to initiating vaping. And importantly, and I think this is very important, high school student smoking has declined at an unprecedented rate, literally an unprecedented rate, precisely during the time in which vaping has become popular in the United States among kids. One recent study concluded that vaping may be, and I quote, diverting adolescents from cigarettes, end quote. Now, I think the evidence for this diversion theory is very limited, but we can conclude with absolute confidence that the fear that e-cigarettes are addicting millions of US kids to nicotine, as has been claimed by the leader of a major organization in the United States, is flatly wrong. It's simply inaccurate. The second concern is that vaping causes some youth to try smoking. We have a wide number of population studies that relate to this issue. Specifically, there are a number of prospective studies, over 20 of them, that find that youth who had vaped but never smoked cigarettes were more likely to have tried cigarettes 6 to 24 months later. Most of these studies have not controlled for logical covariates. For example, fewer than half have included the use of other drugs like alcohol and marijuana, which are indicative of a propensity to use what are illicit substances for kids. Only 3 of them included other tobacco products. I find this astonishing. It is obvious that you have to control for the use of other tobacco products in addition to cigarettes before you ask this kind of question. Many of them omit psychosocial correlates. Does the child's friends smoke? Is there smoking in the child's home? What are the kids' attitudes toward risk-taking behaviors more generally? There are some of these studies that find low numbers of cigarettes in the follow-up period. There's one in particular I'll mention that had only 4 kids who in the follow-up period, they vaped the first period and in the follow-up they smoked. All 4 of them said that in the next year, they had smoked 1 or 2 cigarettes only. All of these studies, with one exception, are looking at the trial of cigarettes in the subsequent period. There is indeed only one study that has looked at progression to regular smoking. Ruyan Sun and her colleagues have completed a new study that demonstrates that when you include all of the relevant, the logical covariates, there's a fair chance that the relationship between vaping and subsequent smoking becomes non-significant. And finally on this subject, I'd like to note that even if you believe that vaping causes smoking, the overall impact on smoking initiation has to be very small. Why do I say that? Well, in part, it's simply a reflection of the fact that I cited earlier. The rapid decline in youth smoking has occurred during the vaping era. We clearly are not seeing any vaping-induced smoking initiation in smoking prevalence data. But you can go beyond that. It's also logical from a mathematical point of view. My colleague David Mendez and I calculated that if you take all of the assumptions that are coming out of these prospective studies, namely that vaping does increase the odds of trying smoking in the subsequent year or two, and you assume that for a significant number of those kids who are trying cigarettes, they become regular smokers, if you work through the math of it, vaping would increase smoking initiation by less than 1 percentage point. Finally, we have the concern that nicotine can harm young people's developing brains. At first, it's important to understand this is based on animal studies. And from those studies, there is evidence that nicotine can affect maturation of parts of the brain that are associated with executive function and decision-making. In theory, this could potentially lead to more impulsive behavior, cognitive deficits, and a higher likelihood of using other drugs. In humans, we do have evidence of neurological changes that are attributed to nicotine in the brains of adolescent smokers. But, and these are important qualifications, there are species differences. We don't know how that matters, whether it matters. There's a question of the relevance of the animal dosing paradigms compared to the actual way in which young people are using vaping and consuming nicotine. There's a confounding of genetic and socioeconomic factors, the influence of other forms of substance abuse, which is common among people who smoke and vape, and the role of pre-existing neuropsychiatric problems that are associated with youth smoking in the US. Importantly, there's no evidence linking youthful nicotine use with later adverse outcomes. So what this means is that if we look at people who smoked as kids, but then quit smoking sometime thereafter, shortly thereafter, presumably, there is no evidence of any cognitive deficits or any influence on executive function. So basically, this is an unknown at this point, but it's a real concern, and it's something we should be paying attention to. Interestingly, we should have been paying attention to it all along. The animal evidence is over 20 years old. Nobody really ever mentioned this until vaping, which is itself kind of intriguing. For a number of reasons, we believe, the authors and I, that it is unlikely that for youth as a whole, vaping is creating dangerous levels of exposure to nicotine. That would not have occurred in the absence of vaping. Why? Because a large majority of tobacco-naive youth do not vape and therefore have no nicotine exposure. Most of those who do vape do so infrequently, and many are experimenting on a short-term basis. Frequent vaping is most common among current or former smokers who have already been exposed to nicotine and indeed may be addicted to it. The most dangerous form of youth exposure to nicotine, cigarette smoking, has declined rapidly precisely as vaping has arisen within the youth population. And I might add that other tobacco product use has declined during this period as well. So I want to turn now to why we believe it's essential to balance concerns about risk to youth with potential benefits for adult smokers. Here I'm going to discuss each of the elements that you see listed below individually. First of all, why vaping's ability to increase adult smoking cessation deserves attention, and a lot of attention. In the US, we like to think that we more or less have solved the smoking problem, but the fact remains that 1 of every 7 adults is a smoker today. We have almost 500,000 deaths a year. That's 1/6 of all US deaths are caused by smoking. And for smokers who smoke for a lifetime and die as a result, they lose an average of 20 years of life expectancy. We know that there are large and immediate benefits of quitting smoking, and smokers are at very high near-term risk of illness and death. I want you to contrast that with the uncertain and future costs of youth vaping. Most young people are not going to experience smoking-related and conceivably vaping-related chronic diseases for 3 decades or more. And likely they won't experience them at all if they quit within a decade or 2. The social pressures to quit smoking are quite high and are likely to remain at least as high as that, if not increase. And we may have quitting aids that will be better in the future. Smoking by young people, the most dangerous form of nicotine use, has declined while vaping has increased. And then finally, there are multiple simulation analyses that conclude that the potential benefits of e-cigarettes substantially outweigh the potential costs. And they do so by a lot, even when you work with the assumption that vaping does increase smoking initiation. I'll turn now to the implications of the heavy emphasis on the adverse effects on youth. First and foremost, adults have a terrible understanding of the dangers of vaping compared to those of smoking. And smokers share that misperception. This likely means that there is a reduced rate of smoking cessation because smokers perceive vaping, I should say a majority of smokers, perceive vaping as dangerous as smoking. Policies intended to prevent youth vaping can have a similar effect. That is, they too can reduce adult smoking cessation. Bans on flavors, or for that matter, bans on e-cigarettes outright, or taxing e-cigarettes at rates comparable to cigarette taxes, as I mentioned, is now the plan of our federal government in the United States. What we need to do is seek a sensible mix of policies that will address both goals. Some policies oriented toward one goal harm the other. I just mentioned 2 of them. Flavor bans or comparable taxes on e-cigarettes, both of them will decrease youth vaping. That's a good thing, but both will decrease adult smoking cessation. That is a very bad thing. So we need to find policies that constructively address one goal with no more than minor adverse effects on the other. I'm going to give you 5 examples of those. We should impose very high taxes on cigarettes and other combustible tobacco products, and a small tax on e-cigarettes. Why tax e-cigarettes at all? Because a tax on e-cigarettes will discourage young people from using them, because young people are far more price sensitive when it comes to nicotine products than are older people. The high tax on cigarettes will discourage both young and old from smoking, but for those inveterate smokers who seem to be incapable of kicking the smoking behavior, they will be given a much less expensive alternative in the form of e-cigarettes. Another one, limit the sale of all nicotine products to adult-only outlets. This is a policy that will please no one, but it's a sensible policy. It won't please the people who are focused exclusively on youth vaping because they want to see vaping banned. It won't please the people who believe that vaping can help adults because they want e-cigarettes readily accessible without having to go out of your way for smokers. But it will address both groups' needs and do so in a way that I think is balanced and fair. We need nuanced, targeted communications that emphasize the realistic concerns about youth vaping. Those should be targeted to kids, and there's lots of ways to do that. And toward an adult audience of inveterate smokers, the potential benefits of e-cigarettes. They should understand that. We should have strict regulation of e-cigarette advertising and marketing. We should be prohibiting marketing that is directed at or indeed attractive to youth and young adults. And we should limit advertising to a switch theme for adult smokers who can't quit smoking otherwise. That is, we should encourage them to try the other methods of quitting first, but if that doesn't work for them, we should encourage them to consider switching to e-cigarettes. And by the way, people worry a lot about dual use of e-cigarettes and cigarettes. It depends on how much of each product is being used. There are people who continue to smoke, let's say, half as many cigarettes as they did before. Dual use is not helping them very much. There are others who will smoke 1 or 2 cigarettes a day and use e-cigarettes the rest of the day. E-cigarettes are probably helping them. And the important point is that there may be a transition period needed during which a smoker moves to dual use and then on to vaping only. And in many instances, such as we've seen in the UK, many of them will quit vaping as well. That's the ideal. The authors of this paper would like to see the US implement the Food and Drug Administration's comprehensive 2017 plan. If you're not familiar with that plan, it's very interesting reading, and I recommend just go Google FDA Comprehensive 2017 Nicotine Plan. You'll find it. It includes the notion of requiring the reduction of nicotine in combusted tobacco products to levels that are not capable of sustaining addiction. Turns out that's very easy to do. It also says that if you're going to do that, you have to ensure the availability of consumer attractive reduced risk nicotine products. We would like to see the FDA develop product standards to minimize the risks for each class of products. So for e-cigarettes, find those that are consumer attractive, consumers like them, and determine which of them emit the fewest toxicants, and make that the standard for future e-cigarette products. And we need to educate the public about the dangers of nicotine versus the dangers of smoke. It is quite astonishing to learn that people in the United States believe that nicotine is the source of the lung cancer, the heart disease, and the lung disease associated with smoking, rather than being simply the addictive agent. Physicians believe the same thing. There's gross ignorance of the role of nicotine and the fact that nicotine-only products are not that dangerous. I have a few concluding thoughts. Former U.S. Surgeon General C. Everett Koop stated in 1998, and I quote, "As we take every action to save our children from the ravages of tobacco, we should demonstrate that our commitment to those who are already addicted will never expire." I very much fear that the latter is at risk today. That concern may be expiring. We can increase smoking cessation through vaping. In the process, we need to focus on the important disparities in smoking and its outcomes. In my country, we see a substantially larger death rate from tobacco among African Americans than among the white population. Smoking rates are higher for other minority groups, particularly Native Americans, than they are for the majority population. We also see that Americans of lower socioeconomic status have a greater propensity to smoke, as do people who are suffering from some form of mental health problem. It's interesting to look at a study by Jamie Tam and her colleagues looking at serious psychological distress, SPD. Smokers with SPD lose 15 years of life expectancy. That's compared to non-smokers who do not have SPD. But Dr. Tam discovered 2/3 of that loss of life expectancy, 10 years, was attributable to their smoking. What this tells us is that helping adult smokers to quit is plainly and simply a matter of social justice. Thank you.